Hi, it's Scott Bassett, and I want to take this video to talk a little bit about the origins of the narcissistic personality, where they come from, the family, obviously, as we all do, hopefully, but and what kind of trauma, abuse they suffer, and the behaviors they adopt to survive the situation they grow up in that makes them narcissistic. So, what are the kinds of situations that produce narcissists? Um, so, the first thing I want to point out is that I don't necessarily see a pattern in narcissistic kind of personality formation just by how the family is necessarily structured. I haven't seen a difference between if it's a nuclear family, if there's 2 kids or 3 kids or 4 kids, how many parents are present, for instance. So I've never found a direct link to any of the actual family structure. I've never seen the pattern with regards to the structure. However, there is a pattern and a correlation, I should say, with the personalities that are already present in the family, the roles that everybody takes on. I also want to point out that while siblings don't necessarily have, let's say you know a narcissistic person and you're thinking about their family, how they grew up, what you can find out about it. Whether they have siblings or not does not affect whether they're narcissists. However, it makes it more complicated because the situations are often more, since there's more people, there's more actors on the stage, things get trickier. So their adaptation that makes them narcissistic is often more, I won't say sophisticated, but harder to figure out. I'll also want to point out that in situations where there are siblings, especially when there's several siblings, there's a strong correlation between the youngest, or I guess the youngest and the oldest. That is, the oldest tends to have narcissistic traits, and the youngest or younger tend to have narcissistic traits, or the full-blown disorder. Now, I have some ideas as to why, and I've read some research as to why, but I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know that anybody is. But usually their relationship, the relationship between both narcissists is pretty, it's obviously very dysfunctional, but the dynamic is interesting and kind of warrants further study, which I'll touch upon either in this video or in a later video. But it's just something I want to point out right now because you'll often see it. The relationship between, if there's 2 narcissistic children in a family, the relationship is often very perverse. But the simplest case I want to touch upon is basically the single child narcissist within a family and why that happens. Well, the reason anybody becomes narcissistic is because there is a fundamental gap between what is expected of you to be considered a good person, to receive positive attention of some kind, and validation, confirmation, form an identity, and all that kind of stuff that happens at a very early age. And there's a gap between that and what they do in order to get that admiration or that positive attention that they need to grow into healthy adults, which they didn't get, and that's why they're narcissistic. So that fundamental gap is the thing you first want to touch upon, and that's where something called the illusion takes place. That's where kind of the illusion pops up and flourishes. You'll notice that with every narcissist, there is a fundamental gap between who they really are and what they do and how they want people to perceive them. So what they do, so people perceive a false image. They can't become good people. They usually never are good people. It's, by a definition, narcissism is very perverse and negative. But that's why we're talking about it. It's because they're so destructive. But that fundamental disjointed behavior between what they say, basically what they say, and what they do. Not the same thing. Who they are and who they pretend to be, who they get other people to believe them to be. Always a big difference, as opposed to, say, you or I, when we think, oh, I'm not being a very good person, I'm going to try to improve myself in this particular area for whatever reason, my own shortcoming. Or we can recognize that and improve upon it. Narcissists can't do that. They have no concept of that. The world, everything operates is what you can get people to believe. And then, as that progresses, the ultimate end goal is get other people to believe it so it can be actualized, and then they can believe it. They want to believe it, but they're not strong enough to do it on their own. That's the fundamental crux of the matter here, the problem. They want to believe something that isn't true, they know isn't true. They're going to force it upon you in an indirect way so that you don't think it's them. It sounds pretty crazy, doesn't it? It is crazy. Then you're going to reflect that back onto them by believing it, and then they're going to get to believe it. That is their goal, to make this fantasy a reality. But by definition, in order for that whole mechanism to work, it has to be false in the first place. So they always live in that lie. And that's why there's just always this deep internal conflict, emotional turbulence. That's where all that stuff generates from, is trying to make the illusion real. Because if the illusion isn't real, they can't live. It's not even a question of whether they're good or bad. It fundamentally, it's like they're dying. So you need to keep that in mind. The illusion is very close to their chest. It's their fundamental being. It's their identity, everything. All the stuff they want you to believe, they have to have it or they will fall apart and possibly become dangerous. Getting past that subject and back to the family, there's that disjointed, that big gap. And it's probably small when they're young, and it starts to grow as they get older, because there's something dysfunctional in the parents. The usual setup is that there's an enabler parent. I want to say usually it's the mom, but I don't know. I don't really have any facts to back that up, so I don't know that that's actually true. That's just been my experience. And then a kind of an abusive father, but an abusive in a way that's not necessarily narcissistic. You can probably just take it as more of a classic old hard-edged person who's very cold and distant and doesn't necessarily support his son, say, taking dancing lessons or something, if you can get that into your head. But somebody who's abusive but not narcissistic, for the most part. So you have this combination, then you have a child who's born and is told conflicting things. Because there is a scary parent, and there is the parent who is trying to avoid the scary parent at all costs. The enabler, by definition, is not going to protect the child from the scary parent. They are trying to avoid the scary parent themselves. And so they will do whatever is necessary, without knowing it, to take the steps that often include throwing the child under the bus, so to speak, which is protecting themselves at the expense of the child's safety. So there you have a relationship where, and this is how dysfunctional families work in general, is that there's the abuser. So you have the hard parent who's abusive but not narcissistic. You have the enabler who doesn't protect the children. The enabler gets the blame in a dysfunctional family, group setting, the family unit. The enabler gets the blame in an environment where people don't express themselves and communicate openly, emotionally. So you have an environment where you can't talk about how you feel or what's wrong. It's all that undercurrent stuff that's not accepted, and that's where the penting up and the rage begins. Well, that all that has to find a way out. We have to express ourselves. There's no way to get around that. Dysfunctional people, want that to not be the case, but they're wrong because they're proof of it. And what happens is that you have this conflicting message that in order to be, you can't express yourself openly. You want to be good, otherwise you're going to be penalized, and you're going to receive untold, unfair abuse for no reason if you don't meet these arbitrary requirements, whatever they are. They're different from every family. I might make a video on the list of I found common ones, but that whatever they are important. If you have experienced the narcissist, you already know what they are. So I don't need to tell you. And so that gap between what's expected and what they can actually do in order to reach that point where they receive positive affection, which they will never get, because it's a dysfunctional family. There is no positive affection. That's the actual problem. But you always think, this child always thinks they're going to get to that point where they're going to be loved, they're going to be cherished, they're going to have that fantasy that they want. So this fantasy starts to form about what it means to be perfect, because it's a black and white comparison. They're either all bad or they're all good. And if they do this thing, they're good, and if they don't, they're bad. And that's really the heart of the issue. That's where it starts. They do these things. Now, the problem with whatever they do, the behavior that's considered good, is that it's considered bad. And because it's a dysfunctional environment, what they do to become good has negative consequences, it has negative effects, which they then don't want to deal with. So, to take the simplest case of the single child, what it often is the case is the child desires to be perfect, because they're only okay and great if they're perfect human beings. They have to believe they're perfect. Now, nobody's perfect, so therein lies a problem, an eternal problem that's never going to go away unless you acknowledge it. So you can see why this child's getting set up for a really bad, run in life, and there's nothing they can do about it. So they stay in this fundamental kind of childlike state where they're trying to gain that affection, that positive attention and love by admiration. It's usually intelligence, competence, whatever it is, something that makes them really great, better than other people. It's always a comparative thing. You're always trying to beat everybody else to get that positive attention and love, which you will never get. So, whatever the setup is, there's the gap, and then all the insidious things that the child does to get the parents' attention to be good. And then they grow up thinking that's how you be good. Now, the final kicker is, and unfortunately for us, this is the case for all narcissists, is that narcissists don't go around being openly bad. That's a bad thing. They're not like other, tumultuous people or psychopathic personalities or whatever. They have to maintain this fundamental illusion that they're good, which means they don't do outright bad in front of people, otherwise you're bad. So they have to avoid the things that fundamentally make them look bad and nobody can deny. But anything else that people believe goes. They'll do anything else to get that positive attention, anything to get that positive admiration, and that gap that the child formed in very formative years, very, very young, a baby even, in order to that difference, that huge inconsistency between what's expected of them and what they have to do in order to get to it. It remains throughout their entire lives. And that's where the illusion kind of blossoms up and forms in order to compensate for that. And that's what forms their personality. So that's a complicated concept. I'm going to go into it more, and I didn't want to get too deep into it because, as you can see, it's a very sophisticated mechanism. It's not really designed, it's just an adaptation. And it's a consistent adaptation because so many people have narcissism. So it's something that happens a lot, and it's very human. But it's still very complicated. It's hard to grasp, and so that's just the one thing I want you to take away is that conflict that they have, which is they feel bad all the time. They're always bad people, and they know they're bad because they're doing bad things. When it actually comes down to it, any of those things came to surface, they would be bad. So they're always trying to compensate by doing what they always do that's bad, but to appear good to other people. And so they're doing bad. They feel bad about it, and then what do? They do more bad things to appear good to people through their manipulation, things like that. So that's what I want you to take away from this short little, it's not so short anymore, anyway, video. And I'll go into this in further detail, families with many children, and how that kind of dynamic plays out, and how narcissism goes down the family line, which does happen. It ripples down for generations. Which is really disastrous, and that's really why I set out to make these videos and stuff so people can understand it and hopefully do something about it, because we're the only ones who can do anything about it, not them. So thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Comment if you have a question, I'll answer it. And like and share and whatever. And thank you so much. And if you want more information on narcissism, be sure to check the description below for my website and to read my book, The 16 Signs of a Narcissist, which goes into great depth about all these topics. So thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.